Hello, thank you for joining our webinar, Delivering on the Growing Appeal of Dairy Alternatives. I am Pam Stauffer, Global Marketing Programs Manager in our Sweetness and Texturizing business, and I'm pleased to introduce two of our dairy experts that will present today. We will hear from Christine Addington, our Technical Account Manager, and Mark Phelan, our Business Development Manager. Please submit questions throughout the presentation and we will answer those at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark Phelan.
Thanks, Pam. Would like to spend some time addressing the plant-based dairy category and how it has evolved. For openers, a lot of questions get raised about, what's the overall trend related to milk and the plant-based milks, being that plant-based milks are the largest subsegment within the plant-based dairy segment. And what you're looking at here is a view of about 14, 15 years of how milk has performed on a CAGR standpoint relative to milk alternatives. If you look at those 15 years, you can see, milk declining about 1.5% during that time period, which is a story in the milk or in the dairy industry that's pretty well known. And you can also see the rise of milk alternatives. And then, a question or a view that oftentimes get asked is, hey, what does, the future look like? And typically, and what we're looking at here is Euromonitor data. Typically, we like to show 3 to 4 years out into the future. So, typically it would be a 2020 view through 2024. But 2020 is such a volatile year because of the lockdown situation and people shopping more at grocery, less, eating out at food service. So what you're looking at here is a forecast just through 2020. And what you'll notice is that the decline in milk is actually forecasted to be faster than what it has been over the past 15 years. And the forecast for milk alternatives is forecasted to rise even more than the past 15 years. So what's going on there? There's a lot of, press and articles about how, food at retail and everything else is growing quicker, and that is true. But what I show here is the split. Oh, I should point out that when I show this data here, this is the total market, so both retail and food service, which is kind of what I'm splitting out here. Here you'll notice that, roughly 30% of all milk volume is done at food service, at 70% is at retail. So milk at retail is forecast to grow at a pretty healthy amount, 6.3%. But that is not enough to compensate for the decline in food service because, as I mentioned, about 30% of milk volume goes through the food service channels. Here's a look at the milk alternatives, also declining at food service, but has less exposure to the food service channel compared to milk, only about 15%. And milk alternatives at retail are forecast to grow at 16%. So net, a 9% increase through the year 2020 versus a decline of 5.3% for milk. And, this is taking into account, the first 6 months or so of the year that are actuals. So this does look to be pretty accurate. Of course, so much can change, which is why we're not forecasting out beyond 2020. So a lot of questions we get to have to do with, well, how are things tracking at retail specifically? And as much fun as it would be to talk about online ordering of food and obviously the impact to food service, I'm going to share some views on what categories are looking like in the retail channels. What I'm showing here is the trend line for all retail, both food and beverage, and how the trend line is for retail on a week-over-week basis versus the same time period last year. So like-for-like time periods. And this black line, as I roll through some slides, is the retail average and will be a benchmark against some other food categories to take into mind. Also, I'll point out prior to March 7th, it's kind of considered a baseline time period where retail was growing at maybe a percentage point on a volume basis versus last year. You get this big stock up period here due to stockpiling following the national emergency. And now we're kind of in this leveling off phase where the retail average, at one point was double-digit growth, but it's starting to kind of feather down to about, 7%. And even in the months of June, it was like at around 4 or 5%. So I'll show some examples just to show you kind of what's driving the retail average. And one of them would be macaroni and cheese. Really driving the overall retail growth. Just a huge spike up during the stockpiling period, and then continuing to grow at double digits through this kind of leveling off phase and driving the retail average in general. Same too with canned soup, really driving that growth. So just reflecting the shopping for home consumption for families. You're seeing a lot of categories like this. These are just two categories in particular to call out because they're so familiar. But not all categories are growing. For example, bottled water. This is not the value added like seltzer type water or whatever, but this is really just kind of the big dominant bottled waters. Had a spiked up during the mid-March timeframe, but then has been not only below the retail average, but actually in negative territory through the months or through the time periods through May. So what's driving that? One part is, hey, probably there's a stockpile at home that people are kind of consuming through, but also, people maybe don't drink bottled water on the go they don't typically drink bottled water at home. It's typically something that gets consumed when you're on the go, right? So you're shopping, you're running errands, you're running the kids to, Little League games, you're traveling to the airport, you drink bottled water. So the same too with granola bars. This is conventional granola bars where, there was a stockpiling phase, but then things are just not only below the retail average, but also in negative territory. So these are obviously non-dairy categories. Let's take a look at some dairy ones. So here's a look at conventional and super premium milks. There was definitely some stockpiling, but not to the extent of the shelf-stable items, obviously, because milk is perishable. And where you're seeing things leveling off is actually pretty healthy growth, roughly 3% through the end of May, which when you consider milk was kind of in negative territory as a baseline, 2.7% is pretty healthy. Another dairy segment, cheese. Big stockpiling phase as well as double-digit growth, reflecting the fact that, longer shelf life for cheese, but also being used in cheese-intensive, home meal occasions, whether it's Italian dishes or sandwiches or even for snacking. Here's a look at ice cream. Again, not to the extent of the retail average when it comes to stockpiling, but definitely netting out in double-digit growth rates through the months of May, and we're seeing that even into June. I would say one constraint that we hear a lot about when it comes to things like ice cream and frozen pizza, it's not out of stock issues, but it's actually, hey, I don't actually have freezer capacity at home for more tubs of ice cream or more frozen pizzas. So there's actually some articles, in the month of April and May talking about how, not only is there a run on toilet paper going on, but there's actually a run on, secondary freezers or chest freezers being purchased for additional capacity for things like this. Okay, so here's a look at plant-based milk. So 22% is where this is netting out, which, one thing to take into account here is that prior to COVID, plant-based milks were growing on a volume basis at about 8% over the previous year, which is already pretty healthy, but still you're seeing about a 14 percentage point lift over the baseline period as things net out. So it really seems like perhaps the adoption rate has even increased during this sort of COVID period. So overall pretty good for these dairy and plant-based dairy segments, but there is one that is underperforming a little bit, which was a bit of a surprise at first, but kind of fits with the narrative that, hey, on the one hand, yogurt was declining slightly prior to COVID, and where we're netting out is, -6, -7%. But again, it kind of fits with the narrative that typically breakfasts were being eaten prior to COVID. They were typically on the go. The people that were eating yogurt were somewhere on the spectrum of being time starved, and yogurt since COVID has really been underperforming a little bit due to that. People have more time to stay at home and make really complicated meals like breakfast cereal. Okay, some other dairy segments really quick. So butter's definitely having a moment, which reflects that at-home cooking trend. So too with sour cream. Okay, jumping back into the world of dairy alternatives. Here's a look at how the share has shifted in different types of botanicals within plant-based dairy. So going back 6 years ago to the year 2014, you'll see that almond milk had about a 2/3 or 66% share. Soy had a 25% share. And you can see how this has evolved over the last 6 or so years. Almond milk is now at 76%. Soy is at 10%. And for a number of years, coconut milk was the number 3, and it held on at about a 5% share of the total segment. But that has changed in the year 2019. Coconut declined about 7% in the year 2019 relative to 2018, and oat has really spiked up. Probably not a surprise, but just interesting to see how oat really has jumped up to number 3 position in the world of plant-based milks, and has been growing on a very nascent basis in the last year. When we look at all plant-based dairy segments, I mean, clearly plant-based milk is off the charts. It would be, there's a break in continuity when you look at this bar chart. It's 26 billion pounds, and it's growing at almost double-digit growth versus 2018. So this is a look at April of 2020 versus the 52 weeks ending 1 year ago. So plant-based milk is growing, and a lot of this doesn't not at all really account for the COVID period, just within that last month of those 12 months. So plant-based milk growing really well. Plant-based creamers is number 2, growing at 32% rate versus the previous 12 months. Plant-based ice cream would be number 3, and just like ice cream overall, plant-based ice cream has actually been in decline, which is a bit of a surprise, but there's some reasons for that. Then you've got plant-based yogurt growing at 31%, and plant-based cheese is really the nascent category that we've been doing a lot of work in. We expect this one will grow very quickly. Then when you look at the penetration by category from a volume standpoint, again, you can see plant-based milk relative to all fluid milk is at 9% penetration. So that's among the highest. You can see plant-based creamers, plant-based yogurt, and kind of the penetration rates relative to the conventional category overall. And again, plant-based cheese, really small at this point. We'll see how that unfolds in the future. Also, how their volume growth is stacked up, just another way to look at it. You can see that most segments are pretty flat to negative when it comes to their conventionals. So like yogurt has been in decline, milk has been in decline, and so too is ice cream. But then you can see a number of the plant-based are really growing quickly. One of the big surprises here is creamers. Both the conventional and the plant-based has been growing really well over the past 12 months. I'll go through one more set of research and insights before turning this over to Christine Addington, who will cover formulation challenges related to plant-based alternatives. And that would be, how do labels matter when it comes to overall packaged food and dairy alternatives? And what I can do is just give you a quick snapshot here. What I'm showing is the something called ingredient tracker, which is something that is proprietary to Cargill that tracks the perceptions that consumers have on over 230 ingredients roughly. And this is something that Cargill does every year for the past 6 years. We really track what consumers think with over 10,000 respondents. Here's a quick look at the 231 different ingredients that we track. Most common ingredients that you'll typically find, everything from animal proteins, plant proteins, fats and oils, sweeteners, texturizers, and so on. I won't go into all these, would love to, but what we do is track a number of different ingredients across a wide swath of consumers. The only discriminator for consumers would be that they have to be responsible for 50% or more of household grocery purchases, and that's the data I'll show you. But we can also drill down to different consumer segments. Certain consumers that are maybe more sensitive to what's on the label. We call those the clean label seekers. Or consumers who are maybe seeking certain diets like low carb, low sugar, plant-based, even things like intermittent fasting. We're able to track what it is that they're seeking or what it is that they're avoiding. One thing we'll note is that when we ask in like the question here that you see on the screen, what specific ingredients or types of ingredients do you avoid when you shop for packaged food or beverage? This is an open-ended response. We don't show a list of ingredients, and we do not give any sort of stimulus. And what we get back is, time and time again, 3 of the top 6 avoided ingredients is actually something to do with sweeteners. So sugar, or number 3 would be high fructose corn syrup, or artificial sweeteners. Those are 3 of the top 6. Once upon a time, fats and oils were higher up on the list, but that's starting to fall down. And it's becoming very clear to us that sweeteners are really things that consumers are looking to pare down. And we see that not only with general population data, which is what you're looking at here, but again, some of those other psychographics and demographic groups that we're happy to share with you as a follow-up. I'll also point out that when it comes to each individual ingredient, we do score these. We ask, hey, how healthful do you think each ingredient is? And then what we come up with is a net score. And what I'll just show you really quick is across the spectrum of sweeteners. So this is a look at everything from honey to high fructose corn syrup and where things rank. And you can see high fructose does not score really well. There's a lot more people saying that this is kind of a 2 or 1, which is considered not good for you, versus those that are viewing this as a 1 or a 5 and a 4, which are considered good for you. Things like stevia, though, more and more are bubbling up, not only to be kind of neutral, but even in what we consider the positive zone. So stevia leaf extract, stevia, for example, stevia sweetener, just different ways of labeling stevia. And then really quick, the last snapshot we'll offer is related to texturizers, emulsifiers, and fibers. So here's a look at everything from oat fiber and positive to things like modified food starch and methyl cellulose in the negative territory. So again, just a quick snapshot, not meant to be exhaustive, and certainly we can take questions at the end of this. We pay attention to clean label because we're obsessed with the ingredients and obsessed with formulations and the applications that they go into, and know that more and more, it's really not just about the functionality, but how these things label. So happy to do a follow-up if you want to reach out to us and share more in detail on these label perceptions. And then with that, I would like to turn this over to Christine Addington, who will take us through plant-based dairy formulation challenges.
Awesome, thanks Mark, appreciate it. If you want to move to the next slide. So just to set the stage, some key differences between dairy and plant-based applications. Plant-based applications are products that are made with a base other than dairy milk. So think of things like nuts, coconuts, legumes, and pulse proteins. They do typically have lower protein than their dairy counterparts unless they're fortified, and they can be cultured to create yogurts and cheeses. Mark, if you want to go to the next slide. So some really popular categories in the dairy alternative space are yogurt and cheese. As Mark mentioned, cheese hasn't quite gotten there yet, but we think it'll continue to grow. We are also seeing a lot of frozen desserts and ice creams. Milks have been around for a while, but beverages are starting to come out as well. Higher protein beverages, coffee creamers are a really popular application space right now. So this category is continuing to grow as Mark just walked us through, but these are the most popular categories we see within plant-based. Next slide. So why are dairy proteins so hard to replace? Well, the simple answer to that is that dairy proteins are highly functional. So they provide functionalities like emulsification. They help with mouthfeel. They add protein. They have a really nice clean flavor. They thicken and they gel, and they have really nice synergies with other ingredients like carrageenan, for instance. Dairy is a staple in our diet. It's a functional building block in animal and human nutrition. And the reason it has remained a staple in our diet is that it's highly functional and nutritionally packed. When you're replacing milk, you're not just replacing one function, you're replacing multiple. And I can't think of one other ingredient out there that's plant-based that has all of these functionalities that milk has. And this is why it's so difficult and challenging to replace. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this is the #1 hardest challenge in this spot. So whenever you start to replace dairy proteins, things like flavor, texture, and appearance are all affected by removing dairy. So these are just some tips to keep in mind as you begin to start formulating these products. First, you want to choose texturizing ingredients that provide functionality of their dairy counterparts. So we'll walk through some good ingredient choices that work really well in this space. Secondly, you want to formulate with plant proteins that have a clean, less earthy, beany notes. This will help ensure that you have a product that is similar to its dairy counterpart. So again, we'll walk through some plant proteins that are good options in this space. Thirdly, you want to ensure good solubility of all ingredients. So when you have ingredients that aren't fully hydrated or not fully soluble, you get gritty or sandy texture, and that's not ideal in this space. Again, we're trying to target their dairy counterparts, which typically have a smooth, creamy mouthfeel. And then lastly, you want to choose a fat source that works best for your application. So again, we'll walk through some good options in this space. Next slide. So some typical dairy alternative ingredient needs, what you want to start off with first is your base, whether that's water or plant-based butter. That'll contribute to flavor and color. So it's important to understand what you want out of the final product. Secondly, you want to consider plant protein. So do you want to fortify? Or are you just using it to add structure? Either way, again, it'll affect your texture, your appearance, and your flavor. Thirdly, you want to consider fat. So you want to choose a fat that emulates dairy nutrition and mouthfeel. Again, this will affect texture and flavor, which is a common theme here. And then finally, texturizers. So these are things like starches, hydrocolloids, fibers. They contribute to water binding, helping with mouthfeel, increasing viscosity. They're really key when you're formulating dairy alternative frozen desserts with helping with freeze-thaw stability. So we'll walk through some good options there as well. Next slide. So not all proteins are created equally. And what this chart is walking us through is some differences between dairy proteins and some popular plant-based proteins that we're seeing on the market. So what you'll notice is that there's a bunch of plus signs on here, and essentially the more plus signs you have, the more functional the ingredient is. So at the top, you see caseinate and whey protein isolate, and you'll notice that they have 3 plus signs for nutritional value. So this is measuring the PD-CAS score, which is very important to understand because ultimately that's what affects your nutrition facts panel. So whey protein isolate and caseinate both have a PD-CAS score of 1. So they're very nutritionally packed. They're a complete protein. They also have really good emulsification properties, texturizing properties, and as you'll notice at the very end, they're highly soluble. This is why milk has such a smooth texture, and that's something that we, again, want to emulate in our plant-based dairy alternatives. Closely behind milk proteins is soy protein. So again, you'll notice that the nutritional value is very high. It also has a PD-CAS score of 1, has really great emulsification properties, texture, binding, and is highly soluble. You have to remember that soy protein has been on the market a lot longer than a lot of these newer botanical plant proteins. And so we know a lot more about it. We've learned how to process it and manipulate it so that it can be more functional in these applications. Pea protein is another great option. It is lower on the nutritional value. It has a PD-CAS score between 0.6 and 0.8. But it does add some really great emulsification properties and is highly soluble. So this is another protein that you see used very often in this space. Other proteins like canola isolate, corn isolate, potato protein are definitely not as functional as some of these other proteins that we just talked about. You'll notice that they are less soluble. Some don't even provide emulsification properties. And so this is why you don't often see these proteins used in this space because they're just not very functional. Next slide. So some different plant proteins to consider for the dairy alternative space. We just walked through pea and soy. Again, these are popular choices because they have really clean flavor and they both have high PD-CAS scores. Pea protein does provide some really nice emulsification properties. It does gel with certain SKUs, and so that can help increase mouthfeel, and it's highly soluble. Similar with soy, it also has a high PD-CAS score, really nice clean flavor. It is the closest plant protein to dairy protein, so again, this is why it's a popular choice to use in this space. Others that we're seeing are chickpea or fava and oat protein. These definitely have a lower PD-CAS score of around 0.6. Chickpea is really great because it has a really nice white color, which again is similar to the dairy counterparts that we're formulating around. It also has really good emulsification and foaming properties, and so you'll see it used oftentimes in vegan cheese, in mayo, in butter. It's a really great protein for this space. Another protein, oat protein, again, is becoming very popular. It's a recognizable ingredient, it has really good consumer perception, so this has become a popular choice. Its flavor profile does lend itself to dairy, but it's not very soluble. It also has bad emulsification and gelling properties, so if this is the protein that you're going to use, it'd be important to consider using texturizers to help bring back some of those emulsification and mouthfeel properties. Next slide. So some texturizing ingredients to use in this space. Fibers are really great. So chicory root fiber, for instance, is used oftentimes in dairy alternatives. It helps bring back solids, which ultimately increases that mouthfeel that we're looking for. It also adds fiber, so it's a really nice nutritional benefit to add to your nutrition facts panel. There are even certain SKUs that can form gels, and so they can act as a fat mimetic. So a really great ingredient, labels really well, and really functional. Starches are also really important to use in this space. Both functional, native, and modified starches can provide structure and mouthfeel, and they really help to bind water and reduce syneresis, especially when you're starting to formulate the plant-based yogurts. You really don't want to have a layer of water sitting on top of your yogurt when you open it, and so starches really help to bind that water and make sure that everything stays together over shelf life. Hydrocolloids like carrageenan or pectin form gels, and so this helps to thicken the products and increase that creamy mouthfeel. We're seeing carrageenan used a lot in vegan cheese to help increase firmness and provide that structure that typically dairy proteins do. And then finally, lecithins or emulsifiers are almost essential when you're formulating these plant-based beverages, because it ensures that the product does not separate during processing or over shelf life. Another benefit to lecithins is that they also help to increase creamy mouthfeel, which again is something that we always strive for. Next slide. Finally, I want to talk about just some plant-based fat and oil sources that we see used in dairy alternatives. All of these are very common across the board in multiple dairy plant-based dairy applications. So sunflower oil is a really nice oil to use because it has high stability, which is really important when you're choosing your oil source. There's different forms available like mid-oleic and high oleic, and it is NGM, so another nice benefit to this oil. Canola oil is another good option. It's lowest in saturated fat and highest in monounsaturated fat, so again lends itself to providing a nice nutritional facts panel for your product. Coconut oil and palm oil are very popular in this space. Coconut oil has great functionality in dairy alternatives and has high stability. It does have some limitations around flavor, but again, this flavor profile tends to lend itself to dairy, and so it is a really nice option. Palm oil and palm kernel oil also have good stability. We're seeing this used in multiple applications like coffee creamers, beverages, vegan cream cheese, for instance. It provides a really nice mouthfeel and has a nice clean flavor profile. And then finally, cocoa butter is a really nice plant-based fat source because it has good hardness, it has a quick melting profile, a nice gloss and shelf life. So we're seeing cocoa butter used in plant-based yogurts, in vegan cheese. There are deodorized and bleach forms available, so that again, we're trying to get back to that clean white flavor of dairy. Cocoa butter is a really great option for that. Next slide. And just for reference, Cargill, as Mark mentioned, is obsessed with ingredients, and so we have a lot of ingredients in our portfolio that we can play around with in this space, and we'd love to help you guys with any formulation challenges you may have. And that's all I got.
Great, thank you for attending our webinar, and this will be posted live on the IFT site for future viewing, and we are happy to follow up with you with any formulation questions or to help you move your product development forward. Thank you.